"You don't own this gate," that's what she said, standing on my property, pointing at the iron gate my grandfather forged with his own hands in 1963. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass, her certainty absolute. She had paperwork, she had a lawyer, she had the entire HOA behind her. What she didn't have was the truth. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, watching her try to claim something that was never hers to take. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to end with words. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. You'll want to see how this plays out. To understand why they lost their minds, you need to know two things: the land and my grandfather. The land came first, 2 acres of open field purchased in 1963, when this area was nothing but dirt roads and wild grass. Emmett Corbett bought it with 20 years of savings from carpentry work, paid in full, no bank involved, no debt to anyone. He built a small wooden house with his own hands, planted a natural hedge around the perimeter, and forged an iron gate from scrap metal he'd collected over years. That gate still stands today, rusted at the hinges, but solid as the day he made it. The lock is brass hand cast, and it still turns smooth when you know how to work it. I was 8 when Granddad first walked me along the property line, pointing out every stone marker he'd set. "Boundaries aren't there to keep people out, Ellis," he said, hand on my shoulder. "They're reminders of what you protect." That day he spread out the original deed surveyor's report from '63 and notarized the purchase agreement across the kitchen table. "Paper matters," he said. "When someone tries to take what's yours, this is what saves you." From that moment I understood why he had built the gate himself and kept meticulous records for decades. The house passed to me when he died at 2018. The will was clear, everything to his only grandson. I didn't sell it. I didn't even consider it. I took my photography equipment, moved into the old wooden structure, and converted the back room into a studio. The inheritance process was straightforward: title transfer, estate taxes paid, in full ownership, registered with the county land office. That's when I discovered something important. While researching the property records, I found the official map showing the HOA boundaries established in 2005. Wellington Meadows Homeowners Association, formed when developers bought the surrounding farmland and built cookie-cutter houses with beige siding and matching mailboxes. The map was explicit: their jurisdiction stopped 50 meters before my gate. My land predated their organization by 42 years. It wasn't part of their community. It never had been. I spent the first weeks restoring the gate, brushing on the same black Granddad had chosen decades ago. The oak trees framed the morning light, their roots older than the HOA itself. I traced over the faded letters of the sign, "Private Property, Est 1963, until each stroke matched the original. The brass lock turned smooth after a careful oiling, just as Granddad had intended. Standing there, coffee in hand, I felt the same satisfaction he must have when first installing it. Standing at that gate with my morning coffee became a ritual. The air smelled like damp earth after the previous night's rain, and the wind moved through the leaves with a sound like distant conversation. I'd stand there and think about what Granddad had taught me. Keep your papers clean. Know your boundaries. Never let anyone take what isn't theirs to claim. Simple rules, honest rules. The kind that don't require lawyers until someone decides they don't apply to them. I didn't know then that someone would test those rules in exactly 1 month. I didn't know that the brass lock I'd just cleaned would become the first casualty in a war I never wanted to fight. But I should have known. The land had been quiet for too long, and quiet never lasts when people mistake proximity for ownership. Granddad used to say that some folks see an empty space and think it's theirs to fill, that they confuse watching something with controlling it. He'd seen it before: neighbors who assumed his silence meant compliance, who thought kindness was weakness. He taught me the difference between being polite and being a doormat, between compromise and surrender. You can share a fence line without sharing your ground, he'd say. And when someone steps over that line, you don't ask them twice to leave. I finished painting the gate on a Tuesday afternoon, the sun warm on my back, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the scent of old metal. The words looked sharp against the black iron: "Private Property, established 1963. More than 50 years before anyone thought to form an association, before anyone decided that matching mailboxes mattered more than history. I locked the gate with the brass key, heard the familiar click, and walked back to the house with paint on my hands and Granddad's voice in my head. That night, I returned the original deed surveyor's map and notarized documents to the steel lockbox, adding my own title transfer, county registration, and tax receipts. Everything was organized, ready. Paper matters most when someone tries to deny it, a lesson Granddad had drilled into me years ago. The first time they showed up, I was cutting dead branches from the oak tree near the eastern fence line. Saturday afternoon, the kind of quiet where you can hear leaves settling on the ground. Then I heard the car and engine slowing down, tires crunching gravel outside the gate. I didn't stop working right away. People drove past, sometimes turned around in the wide spot by the old fence post. But this time the engine cut off. Doors opened. Voices carried across the yard, professional and clipped, the kind that expect to be obeyed. I wiped sawdust from my hands and walked to the window. 3 people stood outside the gate, all dressed like they were attending a business meeting, instead of showing up unannounced at someone's home. The woman in front wore a navy blazer despite the heat, her posture rigid as a flagpole. She had a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, taking pictures of my gate, my house, my trees, everything she had no right to photograph. The 2 people with her, a man and a woman in matching polo shirts with an embroidered logo I couldn't quite make out, were writing notes and pointing at various parts of the property. None of them knocked, none of them called out. They just stood there documenting my life like I was a code violation waiting to be filed. The woman in the blazer tried the gate, found it locked. She rattled it once, as if testing whether I'd been careless enough to leave it unsecured, then pressed the doorbell button mounted on the stone pillar. She held it down longer than necessary, the chime echoing through the house in repeated bursts. I watched from the window for another 30 seconds, letting them wait, letting them wonder if anyone was home. Then I walked out, boots crunching on the gravel path, taking my time. I stopped at the gate but didn't unlock it. The iron bars between us felt appropriate, like the boundary they represented. "Can I help you?" I kept my voice level, my hands visible, my posture relaxed. First rule of conflict: don't escalate before you know what you're dealing with. The woman straightened, adjusted her clipboard, and gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm Claudia Vance, president of the Wellington Meadows Homeowners Association. We need to inspect your property. Not, we'd like to, or would it be possible, need." Like it was already decided. Like my permission was a formality she was graciously going through. I looked past her at the other 2, who had stopped writing and were now watching me with identical expressions of bureaucratic certainty. "Inspect it for what?" I asked. Claudia's smile tightened. "Your tree branches extend beyond the permitted boundary. Your gate doesn't meet the aesthetic standards for this community, and you haven't paid your HOA dues this year." She said it like she was reading charges in a courtroom, each point delivered with practiced authority. I let the silence stretch for a moment, watching her confidence solidify into something harder. "I don't belong to the HOA, I said. Simple, clear, no room for interpretation. Her laugh was brief and sharp. "Every property within this radius belongs to the HOA. You can verify that on our website." She gestured vaguely toward the development behind her, where identical houses lined identical streets in neat suburban rows. "The bylaws are very clear." "So are property records," I said. "The HOA boundary stops 50 meters before this gate. My land was registered in 1963. Your association was formed in 2005. Do the math." One of the polo shirt people shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Claudia like they were waiting for her to correct me. But Claudia didn't miss a beat. "We'll verify that," she said, her voice cooling by several degrees. "But in the meantime, you need to comply with this notice." She pulled a paper from her clipboard and pushed it through the gap in the gate bars. I took it, scanning the contents without reading too carefully. I already knew what it would say. The notice demanded 3 things: trim the oak tree within 14 days, replace the iron gate with a composite wood gate in the approved beige color, and pay 3 years of backdated HOA fees totaling $4,200. Failure to comply would result in fines of $150 per day. At the bottom, in bold print, violations subject to legal action per HOA bylaws, section 7.3. I folded the paper in half, then in half again, and slipped it into my back pocket. "I won't be doing any of this," I said. Claudia's expression shifted from bureaucratic patience to something colder. "You'll regret that decision. We have legal counsel." She said it was like a threat, like lawyers were weapons she could deploy at will. "So do I said, and turned back toward the house. I didn't wait for her response. didn't watch them leave, just walked away with their notice in my pocket and their presence still contaminating the air around my gate. I heard the car doors slam, heard the engine start, heard them drive away. Only then did I allow myself to feel the anger sharp and clean, like broken glass under skin. They had come to my land, photographed my property without permission, and tried to impose rules that had no legal standing, and they had done it with absolute certainty that they were right. After they left, I walked the property line checking for disturbances, found them near the eastern hedge, fresh boot prints in the flower bed soil, compressed where someone had stood to peer over the fence. They had been here before today, before announcing themselves at the gate. The camera I'd installed after inheriting the property should have caught it, but when I checked the footage, 15 minutes were missing from last Tuesday night. Just gone, erased. At the time I'd assumed it was a technical glitch, but now I understood. Someone had access to the local power grid controls, someone who knew how to disable security systems remotely. Claudia hadn't just decided to target me on a whim. She had been planning this. I made two decisions that evening. First, I installed a backup camera system completely offline, recording to local storage that couldn't be accessed or erased remotely. I mounted it in the oak tree camouflaged by leaves, with a clear view of the gate and the entire front approach. Second, I started building a file. I photographed the boot prints, documented the missing camera footage, and filed the HOA notice alongside my property deed and the map showing the boundary lines. Paper matters, Granddad had said. When someone tries to take what's yours, paper is what saves you. I didn't know yet how far Claudia would go, but I knew enough to start collecting evidence. The land had taught me patience. My grandfather had taught me preparation. And Claudia Vance had just taught me that some people mistake silence for weakness. That night, I stood at the gate again, coffee cup cold in my hand, watching the last light fade from the sky. The brass lock gleamed dully in the twilight. The iron bars stood firm. And somewhere beyond my property line, Claudia was planning her next move. I could feel it the way you feel, weather-changing pressure building before a storm. Let her plan. Let her strategize. I had something she didn't. I had the truth, and I had time to prove it. I spent the next week in libraries and county offices as building a case the way my grandfather built that gate, piece by piece, with attention to every detail that mattered. The county records department had everything I needed. The original plat map from 2005 showing exactly where the HOA boundaries began. The meeting minutes from the homeowner vote that established Wellington Meadows as a legal entity, and the complete list of properties included in that initial formation. My address wasn't on it, couldn't be on it. The land had existed for 42 years before anyone thought to draw lines around the neighboring parcels and call it a community. I made copies of everything, had them notarized, and arranged them in a leather folder with tabs marking each section. When I met with the attorney, everyone recommended for property disputes, she spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents before looking up at me with something close to satisfaction. "They don't have a case," she said simply. "Your land is completely outside their jurisdiction. They have no legal authority here." And the HOA called a special meeting and invited me to explain myself. That's how they phrased it in the email. Explain yourself, like I was a child caught misbehaving. I went because refusing would have looked like weakness, and because I wanted them to see the evidence before things escalated further. The meeting room was set up like a tribunal, 15 board members arranged in a semicircle facing a single chair positioned in the center like an interrogation seat. I walked in carrying my leather folder and nothing else. Didn't bring coffee, didn't bring notepads, didn't bring the kind of nervous energy they were probably expecting. I just sat down, placed the folder on my lap, and waited for them to start. The HOA president opened with the same speech she'd given at my gate violations, aesthetic standards, unpaid dues. Her voice had the rehearsed quality of someone who'd delivered this lecture many times before, always with the same result. But when she finished and looked at me expectantly, I didn't apologize or negotiate. I opened the folder, removed the county plat map, and laid it flat on the table in front of me. "This is the HOA boundary, as registered in 2005, I said, tracing the line with my finger. "This is my property boundary, as registered in 1963. They don't intersect." The room went quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. One of the board members leaned forward to look at the map, and I saw doubt flicker across his face. The president's expression hardened. "That map could be falsified," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. I pulled out the next document, a certified letter from the county land office, complete with an embossed seal and a registrar's signature. This confirms that the plat map is authentic and current, I said. It also confirms that my property is not part of Wellington Meadows HOA and never has been. I placed the letter next to the map, both documents facing the semicircle of board members like evidence in a trial. The HOA's attorney, a man in his 50s, with the tired look of someone who'd sat through too many of these meetings, picked up the letter and read it carefully. I watched his shoulders drop slightly as he realized what he was looking at. "Ms. Vance," he said quietly, "these documents appear to be legitimate," but she wasn't ready to concede. "Regardless of property lines, you still need to comply with community aesthetic standards," she said, pivoting to a new argument like the first one had never existed. "Your gate is an eyesore and your trees are overgrown. We have standards here." I closed the folder and stood up, done with the performance. "I don't belong to your HOA," I said, keeping my voice level and clear so everyone in the room would hear it. "You have no authority over my property. You can't inspect it, photograph it, or send me notices about it. If you continue, I'll file harassment charges." I looked at each board member in turn, making sure they understood this wasn't a negotiation. My grandfather bought this land with 20 years of savings. He built that gate with his own hands. I won't let a printed set of bylaws erase what he created. I walked out before anyone could respond, leaving the documents on the table for them to review after I was gone. The attorney could explain it to them in whatever legal language made the truth easier to swallow. I'd done my part, shown them the evidence, given them a chance to back down gracefully. What they did next would determine whether this ended quietly or publicly. I drove home with my windows down, letting the evening air clear my head, and tried not to think about what Claudia's face had looked like when I mentioned harassment charges. Tried not to imagine what she might do when pride overruled common sense. The answer came at 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of a car engine idling outside the gate, then footsteps on gravel, then the unmistakable hiss of spray paint. By the time I reached the window, they were already driving away, taillights disappearing down the empty road. In the morning, I found the message they'd left red paint across the black iron gate letters dripping like blood. "Pay up or leave." The backup camera had caught everything, a figure in a black hoodie and mask, working quickly, glancing over their shoulder every few seconds. Not enough to identify them, but enough to prove they'd been there. Enough to start building a case that would need more than property maps to resolve. I saved the footage printed screenshots and added them to my growing file. Then I left the paint exactly where it was, a visible reminder that some people would rather destroy what they can't control than admit they were wrong. 3 days after the spray paint incident, I received a letter with an official county seal. The envelope looked legitimate, heavyweight paper, embossed letterhead, a return address that matched the planning department's location. But the moment I opened it, I knew something was wrong. The letter claimed my iron gate violated building codes and demanded its removal within 7 days, threatening forced compliance if I didn't act. The language was formal enough, bureaucratic enough, but the details were off. The email address listed for follow-up questions used a generic domain instead of the county's official site. The signature had no direct phone number beneath it, no case file reference number for tracking. And most telling, the letter contained no instructions for how to appeal the decision, which every legitimate code enforcement notice includes by law. I called the planning department directly, reading them the letter's reference number and waiting while they searched their system. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. "We have no record of any violation notice sent to your address," she said. "And we don't handle gate aesthetics unless there's a safety issue. This isn't from us." I asked her to send me an official statement confirming that's something I could use if this escalated further. She agreed immediately, understanding without me having to explain that someone was impersonating her office. "This is a forgery of government documents," she said before hanging up. "That's a criminal offense. You should file a police report." I told her I would, but not yet. I needed them to make one more mistake first. Something bigger than a fake letter, something I could use to end this permanently. The mistake came on Friday night at 1:30 in the morning. My backup camera caught it all. A black SUV with tape covering the license plates pulled up to the gate and stopped with the engine running. 2 people got out, one carrying bolt cutters, the other holding a phone up to record or take pictures. I recognized the second person immediately by the way she moved, that rigid posture that never relaxed even when she thought no one was watching. The HOA president. She stood back while her companion cut through the brass lock I'd cleaned and oiled just weeks before the lock my grandfather had cast by hand 60 years ago. The sound of metal shearing carried across the quiet yard, sharp and final. They pushed the gate open, stepped onto my property without hesitation, and the president started photographing everything. My house, my studio windows, the oak trees, the flower beds. Her companion tried to remove the gate entirely, working at the hinges with a wrench, but the rust had fused the bolts too tightly. After 5 minutes of futile effort, they gave up. That's when I hit the exterior lights flooding the entire front yard with brightness so sudden they both froze like animals caught in headlights. I opened the front door and shouted that the police were already on their way, my voice carrying across the distance between us. The president ran for the SUV but stumbled on the gravel path, falling hard enough that something flew from her neck and skittered across the stones. They drove off fast, tires spitting gravel, leaving the gate hanging open and the severed lock on the ground. I walked out slowly, phone already recording, and found what she'd dropped. A pearl necklace, expensive and distinctive, with an engraved clasp that read CV HOA President. I picked it up carefully, held it under the porch light so my phone camera captured every detail, then placed it in a plastic bag the way I'd seen crime scene investigators do on television. The police arrived 10 minutes later, and I showed them everything: the video footage, the necklace, the cut lock, and the fake letter from the planning department. One officer watched the video 3 times, zooming in on the president's face during the moment when the lights came on and her features were clearly visible. "That's good evidence," he said, almost impressed. "Real good. We'll file this as trespassing, property damage, and attempted burglary. The forgery is a separate charge we'll coordinate with the county." 2 days after the police report, my phone rang with a call from someone who identified herself as a homeowner in Wellington Meadows. Her voice was nervous but steady, like she'd been building up courage to make this call. She told me she was an accountant, had lived in the development for 4 years, and had watched the HOA president operate with increasingly aggressive tactics. "I have recordings from closed board meetings," she said. "The president said you'd been warned about the consequences of refusing to comply. She said you had paperwork, but that didn't matter, that you needed to be taught a lesson." I asked if she would be willing to testify, to go on record with what she knew. She hesitated, afraid of retaliation, afraid of being targeted the same way I had been. "If you can protect me legally," she finally said, "then yes, I'll do it." I met with my attorney that afternoon and told her we were ready to file 4 charges: trespassing, property damage, harassment, and forgery of government documents. She reviewed everything I'd collected: videos, photos, witness statements, the necklace, the fake letter, and nodded once. "This is enough," she said. "More than enough. They're going to lose badly." I signed the paperwork that authorized her to proceed, and 3 weeks later the lawsuit was filed. The real battle had finally begun. I spent 2 weeks organizing evidence the way a prosecutor prepares for trial, every piece labeled and cross-referenced, every timeline verified twice. The video files were converted to formats that couldn't be disputed in court, each one time-stamped and stored on 3 separate drives. I had 6 clips total: the spray paint vandalism, the gate destruction, the trespassing with photographic intent, and 3 earlier instances I'd discovered when reviewing all the backup footage. Shadows moving near my fence-line car, headlights pausing too long outside the property, someone testing the gate lock at midnight before the main attack. The paper trail was equally comprehensive. My grandfather's original deed from 1963, the county plat map with notarized certification, the planning department's written confirmation that they'd never sent me a violation notice, and the fake letter itself with its forged letterhead and fabricated signature. The physical evidence sat in a locked drawer. The severed brass lock, a paint sample scraped from my gate that matched the brand sold at a hardware store 2 blocks from the HOA president's house, and the pearl necklace with its engraved clasp. My attorney had reviewed everything twice and called it airtight. "They can't challenge the property boundary," she said. "They can't deny the video footage, and they can't explain away the necklace or the forged documents. This is as close to a guaranteed win as I've seen in property law." But winning wasn't enough. I wanted the truth. Public wanted everyone who had watched this unfold to see exactly what had happened and why. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, 15 pages of legal argument supported by 47 pages of exhibits. Ellis Corbett versus Claudia Vance and Wellington Meadows Homeowners Association. 4 charges laid out in precise legal language: criminal trespass, willful property damage, ongoing harassment, and forgery of government documents. The damages requested were specific: $8,000 for repairs and security upgrades, $50,000 for emotional distress and lost sleep, $15,000 in attorney fees, $2,000 in court costs. The process server delivered copies to the HOA president by certified mail, requiring a signature that would prove she'd received notice. She called my phone 3 hours later, her voice stripped of its earlier professional polish. "You think you can intimidate me with lawyers?" she said, each word hard and clipped. "You're going to lose everything." I kept my response simple: "See you in court." The accountant who'd called me days earlier posted the story on a neighborhood social platform that night, carefully worded but devastating in its details. She didn't name anyone, directly didn't share the evidence I'd collected, but she told the essential truth. A property owner outside the HOA boundaries was being harassed by leadership that knew it had no jurisdiction. She mentioned forged documents, nighttime vandalism, and video evidence of trespassing. The post spread through the community faster than any official statement could have contained it. Within hours, other homeowners began sharing their own stories in the comments. Excessive fines for minor violations, arbitrary rule changes announced without votes, financial records that didn't match the treasurer's reports. An elderly resident revealed she'd paid $2,000 in penalties for planting flowers, the wrong color money she couldn't afford to lose, and had done it because she was afraid of being sued if she refused. The community split immediately into 2 camps. One group defended the HOA president, arguing that strong leadership was necessary to maintain property values and that my lawsuit threatened the entire development's reputation. The other group, quieter but growing, began questioning whether the leadership had been abusing its authority for years, and my case was simply the first time anyone had fought back with enough resources to win. A local newspaper called, requesting an interview interested in the angle of HOA overreach and property rights. I declined. "Everything I need to say will be said in court," I told the reporter. "That's where the truth matters most." The HOA's attorney tried to negotiate a settlement 3 days before the hearing: $5,000, a written apology, and a promise that no further contact would be made with my property. My attorney relayed the offer and waited for my response. I didn't need time to think. "No," I said, "I don't want their money. I want them to admit what they did in front of a judge." She smiled slightly, like she'd expected that answer. "The hearing is in 10 days, she said. "They're going to try to attack your character, make you look unreasonable. Be ready for that." I told her I was ready. I'd been ready since the moment they first rattled my gate and decided that my property was theirs to control. The land had taught me patience, my grandfather had taught me documentation, and Claudia Vance had taught me that some people only understand consequences when a judge explains them. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more like a conference room than the grand chambers you see in movies. 40 seats for observers mostly filled the air, heavy with tension and the smell of old wood and floor polish. The judge presiding was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen too many property disputes to tolerate any nonsense. She took her seat at the bench with the kind of efficiency that told me she'd read every page of both filings and already knew which way this would go. My attorney and I sat at the left table, documents arranged in neat stacks, everything we needed within arm's reach. Across the aisle, the HOA president sat beside her attorney, wearing a navy suit that matched the blazer she'd worn the first day she showed up at my gate. Her posture was perfect, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the table edge just slightly too hard. The judge read the case summary aloud, her voice flat and procedural. Ellis Corbett versus Claudia Vance and Wellington Meadows Homeowners Association. Charges of criminal trespass, property damage, harassment, and forgery of government documents. She looked up from the papers, first at the defense table, then at ours. "This should be straightforward. Let's not waste time." The HOA's attorney stood smoothing his tie and launched into an opening that tried to reframe the entire conflict. He painted me as an uncooperative neighbor who refused to maintain community standards, someone who used technicalities to avoid responsibility, and deliberately provoked conflict through social platforms and public complaints. "Mr. Corbett has made himself a nuisance," he said, his tone suggesting reasonableness while his words cut. "He's rejected every attempt at compromise and turned a simple matter of property maintenance into a circus." My attorney didn't stand. She simply looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, Mr. Corbett doesn't belong to the HOA. He never has. That's not a technicality, it's the entire case." The judge nodded once, a gesture that said she'd already reached the same conclusion. "Let's see the boundary documentation," she said. My attorney slid the certified county plat map across the table, along with the letter from the land office confirming that my property predated the HOA by 42 years and fell outside its registered boundaries. The judge studied both documents for less than a minute before setting them aside. "This is clear," she said. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over the plaintiff's property. Proceed to the alleged violations." That's when the defense began to collapse. My attorney displayed the video footage on a screen mounted to the wall, each clip playing without narration or commentary. The first showed someone in a black hoodie spray painting my gate at 2 a.m. The second showed two figures cutting the brass lock and pushing through to trespass on my property, one of them clearly identifiable as the HOA president when the exterior lights came on and caught her face in perfect clarity. The third showed her photographing my house, my windows, my trees, all while standing on land she had no legal right to occupy. The courtroom was silent except for the audio from the videos, the hiss of spray paint, the snap of bolt cutters, the crunch of gravel under shoes that shouldn't have been there. My attorney placed the pearl necklace on the evidence table, still in its plastic bag, the engraved clasp visible through the clear material. "This was recovered at the scene," she said. "It belongs to Ms. Vance. She dropped it when fleeing after being caught in the act of trespassing." The HOA president's face went pale, her attorney leaning over to whisper urgently in her ear. "Your Honor," he tried. "My client was merely conducting a property inspection that she believed was within her authority." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Counsel, there's video evidence of your client cutting a lock and entering private property at 1:30 in the morning. That's not an inspection, that's breaking and entering." The final piece was the forged letter. My attorney presented both the fake document and the official statement from the planning department, disavowing it, confirming they had never sent any violation notice to my address. "Forgery of government documents is a felony," my attorney said quietly. "Ms. Vance used her position to create a false legal threat, attempting to intimidate Mr. Corbett into compliance through fraudulent means." The defense attorney had no response. He looked at his notes, looked at his client, and seemed to understand that nothing he said would change the trajectory of this hearing. The accountant from the HOA testified next, her voice shaking but steady, playing the audio recording where the president explicitly stated that I needed to be taught a lesson, regardless of what my property documents proved. The judge took 15 minutes to deliberate, leaving us in silence while she reviewed the evidence one final time in her chambers. When she returned, her expression hadn't changed, but her voice carried the weight of a decision that wouldn't be appealed. "I find the defendants guilty on all 4 charges: criminal trespass, property damage, harassment, and forgery of government documents. Ms. Vance, you are ordered to pay $75,000 in damages to the plaintiff. Additionally, you must resign immediately from your position as HOA president and are barred from holding any leadership role in any homeowners association for 10 years. The forgery charge will be referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution." She looked at the HOA president directly, no sympathy in her gaze. "You abused your position, violated the law, and attempted to intimidate someone for exercising their legal property rights. This court will not tolerate such behavior." The gavel came down with a sound like a door closing. Final, irreversible. I didn't feel triumph, just a deep sense of something settling back into place like a bone that had been dislocated and was now restored. The HOA president didn't look at me as she left the courtroom. She kept her eyes down at her attorney's hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the exit. I stayed seated until the room emptied, then gathered my documents and walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt cleaner than it had in weeks. 3 days after the court ruling, police arrived at the former HOA president's house with an arrest warrant for felony forgery of government documents. I didn't watch it happen, but neighbors who did told me later that she didn't resist, didn't argue, just walked to the patrol car with her head down while people stood on their lawns recording everything on their phones. The cruiser drove past the entrance sign to Wellington Meadows, the one that read, "A community built on trust," in gold letters against white painted wood. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. By evening, the video had spread through the entire development, and by morning, the HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss what came next. The accountant who testified at the hearing was elected interim president by unanimous vote, the only person willing to take on the role after watching what happened to her predecessor. Her first actions were decisive and public. She dissolved the existing board structure, announced a full financial audit to be conducted by an independent firm, and sent formal apology letters to every homeowner who'd been fined under questionable circumstances over the past 3 years. $23,000 in penalties were refunded within 2 weeks, money that had been collected through intimidation rather than legitimate violations. The apology letter I received was brief and direct, acknowledging that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property and should never have contacted me. No excuses, no justifications, just an admission of wrongdoing and a promise it wouldn't happen again. But the damage to Wellington Meadows went deeper than refunded fines. 17 families filed paperwork to withdraw from the HOA, exercising a legal right that existed when an association was found to have violated its own bylaws or engaged in criminal activity. Property values didn't crash, but the development's reputation took a hit that real estate agents couldn't spin away. Houses sat on the market longer than comparable properties in other neighborhoods, and buyers asked pointed questions about HOA management during tours. The community that had prided itself on strict standards and uniform aesthetics now carried the stigma of corruption and abuse of power. Some residents blamed me for that, saying I'd destroyed their property values by refusing to cooperate. Others thanked me quietly when they saw me in town, admitting they'd been afraid to speak up about similar treatment. The HOA's attorney faced his own reckoning. The State Bar Association opened an investigation. After the trial transcripts showed he'd advised his client to continue pursuing legal action, despite knowing the property boundary documentation was legitimate. 2 months later, his license was suspended for 2 years, with a formal finding that he'd failed to provide competent legal counsel and had participated in a scheme to harass someone through frivolous legal threats. He closed his practice and moved to another state. I felt no satisfaction in that outcome either, just a weary recognition that consequences spread further than anyone expects when institutions fail to police themselves. The criminal trial for the forgery charge happened 8 weeks after the civil judgment. The former president took a plea deal to avoid jail time, 6 months suspended sentence, 200 hours of community service, a $10,000 fine, and a 10-year ban from serving in any community governance role. The judge made it clear during sentencing that the only reason she wasn't imposing actual jail time was the defendant's lack of prior criminal history and her agreement to make full restitution. "You used your position of trust to commit fraud," the judge said. "You forged government documents and trespassed on private property. These are serious crimes that undermine the rule of law. Consider yourself fortunate that this court is showing leniency." After the sentencing, the former president's marriage dissolved. Her husband filed for separation within a month, and by the time the divorce was finalized, she'd moved 3 counties away to a rental apartment where no one knew her history. I heard about it through people who had followed the case, but I didn't seek out details. Her life after the trial wasn't my concern. Justice had been served through proper legal channels, and what happened to her beyond that was between her and whatever conscience she still possessed. I'd never wanted revenge, never wanted to see her suffer for the sake of suffering. I'd wanted acknowledgement that what she did was wrong, consequences that matched the severity of her actions, and assurance that she couldn't do it to anyone else. The court had provided all 3. That was enough. Standing at my gate one evening a month after everything ended, I thought about how quickly certainty can collapse when it's built on authority rather than truth. The former president had been so convinced of her power, so certain that rules and lawyers would bend reality to match her will. But power without legitimacy is just force, and force eventually meets something stronger. In this case, documents older than her organization and laws that didn't care about her title. The gate still stood. The land still belonged to the memory of my grandfather, and now to me. And the brass lock I'd replaced was strong enough to last another 60 years. I used the settlement money the way my grandfather would have wanted to restore what had been damaged and strengthen what remained. The brass lock was replaced with one I commissioned from a metal worker who understood the value of handmade things cast from the same alloy my grandfather had used and fitted to the existing mechanism so perfectly you couldn't tell where old ended and new began. I repainted the gate by hand again, the same flat black, the same careful strokes over the letters that read, "Private Property, Est 1963." The flower beds that had been trampled during the trespassing were replanted with native species that would grow deep roots and require little maintenance. And I installed a new security system, but this time I hid the cameras so well that no one looking at the property would know they were being watched. The land looked exactly as it had before any of this started, which was the point. Nothing about my grandfather's legacy had changed except my understanding of how fiercely it needed to be protected. The mornings returned to what they'd been before quiet, predictable mine. I stood at the gate with coffee and watched the light come through the oak leaves, listened to the wind move through branches that had seen 60 years of seasons, and would see 60 more if I did my job right. The new lock turned smooth in my hand when I tested it, the click of the bolt sliding home, a sound that meant security, meant boundary, meant this far and no further. Sometimes I'd see cars slow down as they passed drivers looking at the gate with curiosity, or maybe recognition if they'd followed the case through news coverage or neighborhood gossip. I never acknowledged them. The gate and the land spoke for themselves. One morning I opened the steel lockbox my grandfather had kept under his bed, the one that held all the original documents. I spread them across the kitchen table, the way he'd shown me when I was young, the deed from 1963. The surveyor's map with its hand-drawn property lines, the purchase agreement signed in ink that had faded to brown but was still perfectly legible. I added my own documents to the collection, the court judgment, the certified property boundary confirmation, the police report from the night of the trespassing. Not because I expected to need them again, but because paper matters, because someday someone else might inherit this land and need to understand its history, need to know that it had been defended not with violence or anger, but with documentation and law. I took a photograph of my grandfather standing at the gate in 1963, young and strong, with his hand on the iron bars he'd forged, and placed it on top of the stack. Then I wrote a short letter on notebook paper and folded it carefully before sliding it into the box. "You taught me how to hold on," it said. I did. No one took it. Work returned to normal rhythms. I took photography assignments for families who wanted portraits in natural settings, for magazines that needed landscape shots of the area, for architects who wanted documentation of old buildings before they were renovated. The studio my grandfather had built and I'd converted worked perfectly for editing the north-facing windows, providing steady light that didn't shift throughout the day. Neighbors who'd been silent during the conflict started waving when they drove past, some of them stopping to talk about weather or local news, carefully avoiding any mention of the HOA or the trial. I didn't mind the careful politeness. It was better than hostility and more honest than the fake friendliness that had existed before, when people smiled while wondering if I'd comply with rules that had never applied to me. The interim HOA president sent me a message months after everything ended, thanking me for forcing changes that should have happened years earlier. "The association is better now," she wrote. "More transparent, more accountable. People aren't afraid anymore." I wrote back briefly saying I was glad the organization had reformed, but that I still had no interest in joining it. "I support what you're building," I told her, "but this land stands separate. That's not hostility, it's just history." She understood. Some boundaries exist not to divide, but to preserve. And the best neighbors are the ones who respect lines they don't cross. A year after the trial, I stood at the gate on a morning that felt like all the other mornings, holding coffee that steamed in the cool air, watching leaves spiral down from the oak tree to land softly on grass my grandfather had first cleared 6 decades ago. A child from one of the nearby houses walked past on their way to the school bus stop and paused to look at the gate. "Why don't you get a new one?" the kid asked, pointing at the iron bars with their patches of rust and the hand-painted letters that had been touched up so many times the layers were visible if you looked closely. I smiled. "Because this one has a story," I said. "It reminds me that some things can't be bought. They have to be kept." And I knelt beside the gate, tracing the hand-painted letters, feeling the ridges and remembering Granddad's care, the sanding lantern-lit evenings, the brass lock's satisfying click. Sunlight warmed the driveway, oak shadows stretching. A child passed, eyes wide, hand on the mailbox, fascinated. I stayed still, letting them take in the gate's history and craftsmanship. For a moment, I felt a strange kinship, as if this small observer understood in their own way what it meant to care for something beyond oneself. That pause, that quiet attention reminded me why I'd fought for this land, why I'd poured effort into preserving every inch. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because some things, some pieces of history, some legacies are too precious to leave to chance. The child nodded without fully understanding and continued walking. I watched them go, then turned back to the house, closing the gate gently behind me. The lock clicked into place with the sound of certainty. This land was still my grandfather's, and now it was mine too. Not because I'd fought for it, though I had, not because I'd won in court, though that mattered, but because I understood what he had tried to teach me all those years ago, that ownership isn't about papers or titles or legal victories. It's about knowing what's worth protecting and having the patience to protect it right. The wind moved through the oak leaves. The sun climbed higher, and the land quiet and ancient, and mine remained exactly where it had always been. Elliot stepped back and watched his mother settle behind the wheel, her fingers exploring every curve of the steering wheel, like a child discovering a long-lost treasure. The morning sun reflected off the yellow paint, casting warm light across her face, highlighting the fine lines earned through decades of work, worry, and love. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs, and for a moment she just sat there, absorbing the gravity of it all. "Do you want to take her for a spin?" Elliot asked softly, unsure if she was ready. Dorothy nodded, her eyes still glistening, and placed both hands on the wheel, the engine hum beneath them smooth and reassuring. As she eased the car out of the driveway, Elliot followed on foot, watching the tires roll over the snow-dusted sidewalk. Neighbors peeked from windows, some waving, some nodding, and a few even stepping outside to catch a glimpse of the solar beam yellow masterpiece. The car seemed alive, drawing attention without demanding it, radiating the same warmth that Dorothy carried with her through every room of their home. They drove slowly at first around the block, the car responding effortlessly to her touch. Dorothy's laugh, soft and melodic, broke free in the quiet morning. "I can't believe this. I can't believe you did this," she said, shaking her head as she glanced at Elliot, her smile breaking wide across her face. "It's too bright. It's perfect." Elliot laughed, feeling a rush of relief and pride. "It's not too bright, Mom. It's exactly right. Just like you." The streets opened as they drove toward the park. Elliot followed, noticing how the car handled each turn with ease, sunlight bouncing off the glossy yellow paint. Children waved, dogs barked, and the city hummed quietly around them. Every mile reminded him of the promise he'd made to return the hope his mother had poured into him. At the park, Dorothy parked near a tree-lined path, stepping out with laughter and tears still shaking her shoulders. "I don't know how I'm going to drive this without feeling like I'm breaking it," she said, gazing at the polished rims. Elliot took her hand. "You won't break it, Mom. This isn't just a car. It's love, recognition, everything you gave me." She looked around, then back at him. "You made me feel like a kid again, like all the hard work mattered," she whispered. Elliot nodded, the weight of the moment pressing on him, yet mingled with pride and love. Dorothy slid back inside the car, this time confident. She pressed the accelerator gently, the vehicle gliding forward effortlessly. Elliot followed, watching her laughter spill into the crisp morning air. For the first time in years, their lives felt lighter, unburdened. Each turn and glide down the sunlit street was a testament to love, perseverance, and the quiet miracles of life, finally granting those who deserved them. Back at the house, Dorothy parked, stepping out with newfound assurance. She hugged Elliot longer this time. "Thank you," she said, the words heavy with decades of sacrifice. Elliot smiled, warmth spreading through him. "No, Mom. Thank you for everything, for letting me give back even a little." She jingled the keys with a laugh, and together they walked inside the solar beam yellow, gleaming behind them like hope made tangible proof that persistence, love, and heart could outshine every struggle.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe.